icons. We're joined now by Mark Anthony Neal in Madison, Wisconsin. He's professor of Black popular culture in the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He also hosts the weekly webcast called Left of Black and blogs at newblackmen.blogspot.com. Mark Anthony Neal, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the significance of the death of Whitney Houston?
Thank you. First, thank you for having me on this morning, Amy. The significance of Whitney Houston, you know, she is part of a generation of what I call black pop crossover artists that would include Eddie Murphy, it would include Michael Jackson, the late Michael Jackson, and even basketball player Michael Jordan, in that they had an unprecedented amount of access to the American mainstream. We had never seen that level of black celebrity before. There were precursors, obviously, and predecessors to their careers in terms of in terms of their own musical or even athletic careers, but in terms of the kind of access that a woman like Whitney Houston had to the American mainstream, her success in that mainstream was really unprecedented.
And talk about what it is that she accomplished in her all-too-short life. I mean, in terms of the kind of music she sang, what she represented, who she influenced in her music.
You go back and look at her lineage. You know, included in her family is the great Aretha Franklin, who redefined soul music. In fact, defined soul music in the 1960s. But also Dionne Warwick, you know, who chose a much more of a crossover pop style. What you see in Whitney Houston in the 1980s is really the coming together of two very different streams of black popular music from the 1960s. And she perfected it. I mean, she really found the perfect pitch for what was really pop music. I think in some ways we do an injustice to Whitney Houston to even think of her as an R&B singer. She really transcended R&B as it was even in the 1980s. She was, you know, America's pop princess, and definitely black America's pop princess. But when you see the successes of what she did, right, and of course there's a price that she paid for this level of celebrity. We see the same thing with the late Michael Jackson. But to think that in 2012 that LL Cool J, right, coming out of hip-hop, you know, 16 years old when he records his first album in 1984, that someone like LL Cool J would be hosting the Grammy Awards, you know, 25 years later is simply amazing, and it's a testament to the level of success that someone like Whitney Houston had as a crossover artist in the 1980s. Can
you give us a brief life history of Whitney Houston? Growing up, being born in Newark, New Jersey, the New Hope Baptist Church that was the center of her young life.
You know, she's a working class girl, working class, lower middle class girl. Her mother, of course, is the legendary vocalist Cissy Houston, who was most well known as a backup singer in the 1960s, as a member of the Sweet Inspirations, regularly backed up folks like Aretha Franklin. You know, so she had access to seeing what this music industry was. In some ways, Whitney Houston's career is planned and constructed. Once they heard that talent, there was no question that they had to find the right vehicle to be able to cross her over. You know, so we start to see her doing things in terms of the fashion industry, you know, when she's a teenager. They make the connections with Clive Davis, and Clive Davis, of course, is a critical person, right? This is someone who helps manage the careers of folks like Laura Nyro and Miles Davis and Carlos Santana in the 1960s. You know, he's at the centerpiece of creating what we know as a boutique model of black music recording, starting with Philadelphia International Records with Leon Huff and Kenneth Gamble in 1972, and going forward to folks like Babyface and L.A. Reid and LaFace Records, which, of course, worked with Whitney Houston, you know, at some point in her career. So she was perfectly set up to have this kind of crossover appeal. They made sure to establish her that they would connect her with R&B artists. So she works with Jermaine Jackson. She works with the producer Kashif. And they find a way to introduce her to black radio, but also with this eye on that she would have this incredible, you know, success as kind of a crossover artist. And of course, she achieves that. You know, when you think about the number of kids who were my age in the 1980s, you know, late teens and early 20s, who all talked about, regardless of race, how Whitney Houston was their first crush. It speaks to how successfully she made that transition. And then, of course, she went into acting. You know, folks forget how really great she was in films like Bodyguard and Waiting to Exhale and The Preacher's Wife, and really had established herself as a multimedia presence in terms of American mainstream culture.
And then talk about her marrying Bobby Brown, the turmoil in her life, the terrible problems she had with drugs and alcohol.
You know, there is enough evidence to suggest that, you know, her marriage to Bobby Brown was not her first introduction to drugs. I mean, we're talking about American celebrity culture, so this stuff is not unusual. One of the interesting things about Whitney Houston's trajectory is at some point in the late 1980s, again, in some ways she's a groundbreaker in terms of being able to achieve this mainstream success, and she had to deal with criticisms coming from black folks, from her black audience, that in fact she had crossed over too much, that there was, this feeling that there was a lack of authenticity in who Whitney Houston was. And many folks often read her marriage to Bobby Brown as an attempt, to reclaim a ghetto past, if you will, that it was to give her some sense, a street scene sheen that, of course, Bobby Brown had at the time. Clearly, there was a connection with them because they wouldn't have stayed together so long, no matter how tumultuous their marriage was. They clearly loved each other. The product of that, of course, is their daughter, Bobby Christina. And I think, Bobby Brown, in some ways, is an easy target here to suggest that, her marriage to Bobby Brown leads to her, falling down in terms of the way that we saw her as America's pop princess. Folks forget at the time that they got married, Bobby Brown was also at the peak of his career. There are many folks who looked at him for resuscitating what we knew as R&B music in the late 1980s via his, productions with Teddy Riley and so-called, New Jack Swing. So both of them paid a price, I think, for their addictions.
And we're going to break and come back and talk about Don Cornelius and Etta James. We're speaking with Mark Anthony Neal, professor of Black Popular Culture at the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. This is Democracy Now!, back in a minute.